Every mountain region in this country has a family that longtime locals still won't fully discuss, even generations after that family supposedly vanished from the record entirely. This is the story of one such family, pieced together from county court filings, a state investigator's private case file, and the fragmented oral history of a community that spent the better part of a century trying to forget any of it ever happened. If you appreciate a story built from genuine historical documentation rather than simple invented legend, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because this channel exists for exactly this kind of story, and I put out a new one every single week. Alright, let's begin. Part 1. The Land Along Perished Creek. The creek itself appears on modern maps under a different, more sanitized name, but for well over a century, the small, isolated community of hill country residents who lived along its banks knew it only as Perished Creek, a name whose origin, according to the handful of local historians I was able to track down during my research, predates even the Speight family's arrival in that hollow, tied to an earlier, only partially documented tragedy involving an entire pioneer settlement lost to a combination of harsh winter conditions and, according to the vaguest and oldest surviving fragments of local oral history, something considerably harder to explain than simple weather. The Speight family settled along that creek sometime in the early 1850s, according to the earliest surviving county land records, establishing a homestead in a particularly remote, difficult stretch of the hollow that most other settlers of that era had deliberately avoided, drawn, according to family lore that survived, in fragments, well into the 20th century, by a stubborn conviction that the isolation and difficulty of that particular land would keep them free from the kind of outside interference and judgment that Patriarch Josiah Speight, the family's founding figure, reportedly held in deep and lasting contempt. For the better part of 4 decades, the Speight family lived in a state of almost complete isolation from the surrounding community, venturing into the nearest proper town only rarely, and generally regarded by their few distant neighbors as unusually private, unusually insular, and, according to several surviving accounts that grew more common as the decades progressed, unusually prone to a kind of collective strangeness that most neighbors initially attributed simply to generations of extreme isolation and, not infrequently in that era and that region, extensive intermarriage within an already small and self-contained family group. Part 2. The first documented complaints. The earliest formal documentation of concern regarding the Speight family comes from a county court filing dated 1891, a petition brought by a small group of neighboring landowners requesting a formal investigation into what the petition describes, in the careful, restrained legal language typical of that era, as activities of a nature detrimental to the peace and moral welfare of the surrounding community. The petition itself, which I was able to access through a considerable amount of correspondence with the county's Historical Records Office, does not specify in detail exactly what activities the petitioners were referring to, a frustrating gap in the documentation that I initially assumed reflected simple legal convention of that era, until I located a separate, considerably more detailed private letter written by one of the petitioners, a farmer named Cornelius Whitlock, to his brother in a neighboring county, a letter that survived within his family's private papers for well over a century before eventually being donated to the same regional historical society that has preserved several of the primary sources for stories I've brought you before. Cornelius wrote that the immediate catalyst for the petition was the disappearance, over the preceding 2 years, of no fewer than 5 individuals from the surrounding community, including 2 young farmhands, an elderly widow who lived alone on a small property adjacent to the Speight land, and, most disturbingly according to Cornelius's own account, 2 children from a neighboring family who had gone missing while gathering firewood along a stretch of forest bordering the Speight property, never to be seen again despite an extensive search effort at the time. Cornelius wrote that while no direct evidence linked the Speight family to any of these disappearances, a pattern of deeply unsettling local rumor had developed over those same 2 years, involving strange lights and sounds reported near the Speight homestead late at night, livestock belonging to neighboring farms found dead or simply vanished under circumstances neighbors struggled to properly explain, and, in a detail that Cornelius recorded with evident reluctance even in a private letter to His own brother, at least 2 separate accounts from local hunters describing what they characterized only as considerable and unnatural activity, observed from a distance near a particular clearing on Speight land. Activity the hunters themselves refused, according to Cornelius's letter, to describe in any further detail whatsoever. If this story is already unsettling you, and I hope it is, now's a good time to subscribe, because what the county's eventual investigation uncovered is considerably more disturbing than even these early rumors suggested. Alright, let's continue. Part 3. The investigation begins. The county court, according to surviving records, ultimately authorized a formal investigation into the Speight family in the autumn of 1891, appointing a state-affiliated investigator named Thaddeus Corwin, whose detailed private case file, remarkably preserved for well over a century, forms the single most extensive and disturbing surviving primary source for this entire story, and the source from which the majority of what follows is drawn. Corwin's initial notes describe considerable difficulty simply gaining access to the Speight property, arriving on his first visit to find the family's patriarch, by that point an elderly Josiah Speight, along with several adult sons and their own extended families, uniformly uncooperative and openly hostile to his presence, refusing him entry beyond the immediate yard surrounding the main homestead, and providing only the barest, most dismissive responses to his initial questions regarding the recent disappearances and the pattern of unsettling local rumor that had prompted his investigation in the first place. Corwin's notes describe his growing unease during that first visit, prompted not by any single overt threat or hostile action from the family, but by what he characterized as a pervasive, deeply unsettling quality to the entire homestead and its inhabitants, an atmosphere he struggled to properly articulate in his own professional notes beyond describing a persistent sense that he was being carefully, deliberately managed and observed throughout his brief visit. Every question he asked, apparently anticipated and deflected with a practiced, unified consistency across multiple family members that struck him as considerably more coordinated than the simple, unified privacy of an insular rural family. Corwin returned to the property on several subsequent occasions over the following weeks, gradually building what limited rapport he could with certain, more peripheral members of the extended Speight family, particularly several younger women who had married into the family from outside the immediate hollow and who, according to Corwin's careful notes, seemed to display a considerably greater degree of unease and reluctance regarding the family's activities than the core Speight bloodline itself ever demonstrated. Part 4. The First Confession. Corwin's case file describes a breakthrough in his investigation occurring roughly 6 weeks into his inquiry, when one of these peripheral family members, a young woman named Sarah Speight, who had married into the family several years earlier and by that point had 2 young children of her own within the household, approached him privately, away from the rest of the family, and requested his assistance in leaving the property entirely, describing a state of genuine, desperate fear that Corwin's notes record as immediately and unmistakably distinct from the careful, guarded hostility he had encountered from every other family member up to that point. Sarah's account, recorded by Corwin in extensive detail across several separate private conversations conducted well away from the Speight homestead itself, describes a family whose outward appearance of simple rural isolation and eccentricity concealed something considerably darker and more organized than mere social withdrawal. She described the family maintaining what she characterized as a set of deeply held, generations-old beliefs and practices, centered around a particular clearing on the family's property, a location she herself had only been permitted to approach on a small handful of occasions during her years married into the family, in which she described with visible, lasting distress even years removed, according to Corwin's notes, from her actual direct experience of the place. She described the clearing as containing a series of old stone markers, arranged in a pattern she struggled to properly describe, that the family regarded with a reverence bordering on outright worship, tracing the family's own attachment to that specific stretch of land back to founding patriarch Josiah's earliest years on the property, when he had apparently discovered something at that clearing that fundamentally reshaped his understanding of the world and his own family's place within it. An event Sarah herself had only ever heard referenced obliquely, in hushed, careful family conversation, as Josiah's finding. She described the family maintaining a practice, carried out with disturbing regularity over the decades, of what she characterized only as offerings made at that clearing, offerings that she strongly implied, though Corwin's notes record her considerable reluctance to state the matter directly even in private, involved considerably more than simple livestock or agricultural produce, and which she connected, with visible and lasting horror, to the pattern of disappearances that had prompted the original county investigation. If you're still with me, this is genuinely the part of the story where it gets considerably worse. And I do want to say, one more time, subscribe now if you haven't, because what Sarah eventually told Corwin about what she'd personally witnessed at that clearing is the reason this case has stayed with researchers, in fragments, for well over a century. Alright, part 5. Let's continue. What Sarah witnessed. Corwin's notes record Sarah eventually describing, across several increasingly detailed conversations as her trust in the investigator grew, a specific event she had witnessed roughly 2 years prior to their conversations, an event she connected directly to the disappearance of the elderly widow whose case had been among those cited in the original county petition. She described being summoned, along with the rest of the family's adult members, to the clearing on a particular autumn evening, an occurrence that she understood, by that point in her years married into the family, to represent one of the periodic gatherings the family conducted at that location, though she stated she had never before been permitted to witness the full proceedings, having always previously been kept at the periphery of these gatherings under the pretense of tending to younger children. Sarah described the gathering itself as centered around the stone markers she had previously mentioned, with the elderly patriarch Josiah, by that point extremely frail, but still regarded by the entire family with what she characterized as unwavering, almost fearful deference, leading what she could only describe as a ritual observance, conducted in a manner and language she struggled to fully understand, involving repeated phrases and gestures that had clearly been passed down and practiced within the family across multiple generations. She described the widow, the same woman whose disappearance had been reported to county authorities, being present at the gathering, though in a state that immediately struck Sarah as deeply wrong, moving and responding with a strange, glassy compliance that bore no resemblance to the woman's typical demeanor, as though she had already been fundamentally altered by some process Sarah had not personally witnessed prior to that evening. Corwin's notes record Sarah's account growing considerably more fragmented and distressed as she described the remainder of that evening, and he noted, with evident professional restraint, his own difficulty determining exactly how much of what she was describing represented literal, direct observation, versus a kind of retrospective psychological reconstruction shaped by years of accumulated fear and dread surrounding a family and a practice she had grown to genuinely despise. What she did convey clearly and consistently, across multiple separate conversations, was her absolute conviction that the widow did not survive that evening's gathering, and that whatever ultimately became of her at that clearing was directly connected to something the family clearly believed inhabited or was somehow bound to that specific location, something they referred to, in the hushed, reverent language of the gathering, only as the keeper of the hollow, a phrase Sarah herself could offer no further explanation or elaboration for, beyond her own evident, lasting terror at having witnessed whatever role that entity apparently played in the proceedings. Part 6. Corwin's own visit to the clearing. Corwin's case file describes his own decision, made roughly 2 months into his investigation and following extensive further corroboration gathered from Sarah and, eventually, from 2 other peripheral family members who came forward independently with broadly consistent accounts, to attempt his own direct examination of the clearing Sarah had described, accompanied by a small party of deputized local men willing to assist him despite the by then considerable local unease surrounding any direct confrontation with the Speight family. Corwin's notes describe the party approaching the clearing under cover of daylight, deliberately choosing conditions they believed would minimize risk, and finding, upon arrival, a location that matched Sarah's description in every significant detail, a series of weathered stone markers arranged in a pattern Corwin himself struggled to properly categorize or explain, surrounded by a stretch of forest that several members of his own accompanying party remarked upon as displaying an unusual, unsettling quality, difficult to articulate but immediately, viscerally apparent, to every man present. Corwin's notes record the discovery, at the center of the clearing, of physical evidence that finally provided the county investigation with concrete, undeniable confirmation of the disappearances' connection to the Speight family's practices at that location, evidence that Corwin documented with careful, professional restraint in his official report, but described in his own private, separate notes, with considerably more raw and unguarded horror than his formal documentation allowed him to properly express. I want to be careful in describing this part of the story to you, to maintain the same restraint that Corwin himself ultimately settled upon in his official documentation. What his party discovered at that clearing confirmed, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the missing individuals cited in the original county petition had indeed met their end at that specific location, through a process that Corwin's own private notes describe, in language he clearly struggled to commit even to a private, personal record, as bearing disturbing physical characteristics he was entirely unable to reconcile with any conventional explanation of ordinary violence or ritual killing that his considerable professional experience had previously prepared him to encounter. If this story is getting to you the way I hope it is, subscribe now, because I need to tell you what happened when Corwin finally confronted the Speight family directly, and about the fate that ultimately befell the family itself, which remains, even now, one of the strangest resolutions I've encountered in all my research for this channel. Alright, let's continue. Part 7. The Confrontation. Corwin's notes describe organizing a considerably larger party of deputized local men and state-authorized law enforcement in the weeks following the discovery at the clearing, intending to formally arrest the family's core adult members and bring an official end to whatever practice had claimed at least 5, and quite possibly considerably more, lives from the surrounding community over the preceding decades. The party arrived at the Speight homestead in the early winter of 1892, according to Corwin's notes, to find the property in a state that immediately struck him as deeply unusual, the family's main residence and surrounding outbuildings apparently abandoned in haste, with considerable personal belongings and provisions left behind in a manner inconsistent with any planned, deliberate departure. Corwin's notes describe a thorough search of the property turning up no trace whatsoever of the family's core adult members, Patriarch Josiah included, though several of the more peripheral family members, including, notably, Sarah's own young children, were discovered still present on the property, left in the care of an elderly relative who claimed, according to Corwin's notes, complete ignorance of where the rest of the family had gone or why they had apparently departed so suddenly and so completely. Corwin's party expanded their search to the clearing itself, finding it, upon their arrival, in a state he described in his private notes with the same difficulty and restraint that characterized his account of the original discovery there weeks earlier. The stone markers remained in place, apparently undisturbed, but the surrounding area showed signs of what Corwin's notes describe only as considerable and violent disturbance, a phrase he declined to elaborate on further in either his official report or his private notes, beyond a single, striking marginal comment expressing his own conviction, recorded nowhere else in the surviving case file, that whatever the Speight family had spent generations maintaining a careful, deferential relationship with had, in the final accounting, proven considerably less patient and considerably less forgiving than the family themselves had apparently believed. No trace of Josiah Speight or the core adult members of his family was ever definitively located following that final visit to the property, and the official county investigation, despite Corwin's own evident and lasting personal conviction that a complete resolution to the case remained frustratingly, permanently out of reach, was ultimately closed within the year. The surviving peripheral family members relocated, according to sparse county guardianship records, to relatives in neighboring counties, and the Speight property itself left, from that point forward, entirely unclaimed and unoccupied. Part 8. Sarah's final account. Corwin's case file includes one final, extensive conversation with Sarah, conducted several weeks after the failed attempt to locate and arrest the family's core members, in which she offered what remains the closest surviving account to an actual explanation of what may have ultimately happened to the family's core adult members during their apparent final, hasty departure from the property. Sarah told Corwin that in the days immediately preceding the family's disappearance, She had overheard fragments of increasingly tense and fearful conversation among the family's elder members, references to the entity they referred to as the Keeper growing considerably more agitated and demanding than she had ever previously understood it to be during her years married into the family, and to Josiah himself expressing, in his own private conversations with his adult sons, a growing conviction that the family's long-standing arrangement with whatever inhabited that clearing had somehow shifted or soured in a manner none of them fully understood, requiring, in his own words as Sarah recalled them, considerably more than the Hollow has ever asked of us before. Sarah told Corwin that she believed, based on these overheard fragments and her own accumulated understanding of the family's decades-long practices, that the core adult members had made a final, desperate attempt to satisfy whatever escalating demand the entity at the clearing had placed upon them, an attempt that, based on the state in which Corwin's party ultimately found that location, had evidently failed catastrophically, resulting in whatever fate ultimately befell the family's core bloodline, a fate that Sarah herself, despite her considerable accumulated knowledge of the family's beliefs and practices, professed complete and genuine uncertainty about, beyond her own private, unwavering conviction that none of them had survived whatever final confrontation had taken place at that clearing in the days before the search party's arrival. Part 9. The property in the decades that followed. The former Speight homestead and the surrounding property, according to sparse but consistent local record and oral history collected by regional folklorists decades later, remained entirely unoccupied and largely avoided by the surrounding community for well over half a century following the events of 1892, a pattern of sustained, multi-generational avoidance that mirrors closely the pattern I've documented in several other cases I've brought to this channel, and which I've increasingly come to regard as a genuinely significant indicator of the underlying reality behind these stories, given how thoroughly it runs against the ordinary, practical instincts of rural communities to reclaim and repurpose and used land whenever circumstances reasonably allow. A handful of scattered later accounts describe occasional, unsettling encounters reported by hunters and other rare visitors to the general area over the following decades, broadly consistent in character with the kind of phenomena described throughout this story, though none of these later accounts approach the detail or documentation of Corwin's original case file, existing instead largely as fragments of regional oral history, passed down and gradually softened, generation by generation, into the kind of vague, half-remembered local legend that most people in that region today would likely dismiss as simple rural superstition, entirely unaware of the extensive, carefully documented investigation that originally lay behind it. Part 10. Closing Thoughts. I've told you this story with as much historical care and accuracy as Thaddeus Corwin's remarkably detailed, remarkably preserved case file allows, supplemented by Cornelius Whitlock's private correspondence and the fragmentary later oral history collected by regional folklorists decades after the events themselves. I want to close by being honest with you about the considerable uncertainty that remains at the heart of this case, even after everything Corwin's investigation managed to document and confirm. I don't know, with any real certainty, what the Speight family actually encountered at that clearing sometime in the early years of their settlement along that hollow, or what fundamental transformation founding patriarch Josiah's own understanding of the world underwent as a result of whatever he found there. I know only that a family maintained, across multiple generations, a set of practices that Corwin's investigation ultimately, definitively connected to a documented pattern of disappearances and violent death spanning at least several decades, and that whatever the family had spent that time carefully, deferentially managing ultimately, in the final accounting, consumed the family itself in a manner that even Corwin, an experienced and professionally skeptical investigator, was never able to fully explain or resolve, even in the privacy of his own personal notes. If you ever find yourself researching or exploring the history of genuinely isolated, multi-generational family properties in remote rural regions, particularly properties that surrounding communities seem to have avoided with unusual, sustained consistency across multiple generations, I want you to take that pattern of avoidance seriously, the way Corwin's own investigation, whatever its ultimate limitations, clearly did. Some families don't simply vanish from isolated properties because circumstances or fortune eventually turned against them. Some families, it seems, spend generations carefully managing an arrangement with something considerably older and considerably more patient than any single family line could ever hope to fully understand or control, until, eventually, whatever they were managing finally, catastrophically, stops honoring whatever terms that arrangement was originally built upon. That's the story of the Speight Clan of Perished Creek, told as completely and as faithfully as the surviving historical record allows, and it remains, to this day, one of the most extensively documented yet ultimately unresolved cases I have ever brought to this channel. If this one kept you up, do me a favor and subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications, because I put out a new story just like this one every single week, and I would genuinely hate for you to miss what's coming next. Drop a comment below and tell me whether you believe Sarah's account represents a genuine, if incomplete, window into something authentically supernatural, or whether you believe, as some researchers I've corresponded with about this case have argued, that we're looking at generations of severe, isolated psychological dysfunction within a single extended family, dressed up across generations of retelling, in the language and imagery of something considerably more mysterious than the grim, entirely human reality likely ever actually was. Thank you for listening. And if you ever come across an old, long-abandoned homestead deep in genuinely isolated country, one that the surrounding community seems to have avoided for generations without ever quite explaining why, I hope you remember the Speight family story, and I hope you leave whatever clearing you might find on that property entirely, respectfully, undisturbed.